I've been asked to create a video on the Linux CNC portion of my DIY mill build. Linux CNC is a combination of a Linux distribution with a special version of the Linux kernel that's designed for real-time use. It has a low latency and trades efficiency for tighter processing loops so that the machine operations don't get held up. Timing is quite critical for that use case, although less so as the usage of parallel ports has gone a little bit downhill, if you can even find a computer with a parallel port these days. The Linux CNC documentation is very good, but like anything this complex, comprehensive, and customizable, not to mention cool, figuring out where to find what you need to know can be quite a conundrum. In any case, I'm going to walk you through the process. First, let's look at the documentation and see what it has to say about downloading and installing Linux CNC. It's pretty typical for Linux distribution. As you may or may not know, there are some pretty hairy hardware configurations out there that require some pretty specialized methods to install, but we're not going to be putting a hard drive in another computer to manually write boot block information today. We're just going to do a basic install. So there are two versions of the real-time kernel to choose from. The documentation mentions another one, but I don't dabble in black magic anymore, so I won't mention the XenoMy kernel again. The fundamental difference between the two is the older RTAI kernel is a bit more hardcore and is not really necessary for most builds these days, whereas the preempt real-time kernel is more like the regular Linux kernel, is more compatible with hardware drivers than the more strict and inflexible RTAI kernel. Besides, in any case, I prefer to use Ethernet with Mesa cards, and those require the preempt RT kernel, so that's what I'm going to use. So now that we've decided which kernel to use, we need to decide on which download to use. There are a bunch of options, but I'd suggest just downloading the live image, as you can see right here. After the download finishes, we'll need to copy the image to a USB storage device, but you can't just copy the files over. You have to take steps to prepare the USB to boot the computer. There are several ways to do this discussed in the Linux CNC documentation, including a way to do it with a command line on a Mac OS computer. That works quite well, by the way, so if you're a Mac user, the only issue you might run into is figuring out what device name your USB drive has been assigned. Don't get it wrong, or you could really screw up your machine and have to reinstall from a scratch internet boot. Not that I've ever had to do that. It's a bit easier in Windows since they make the drive letters fairly visible. I'd like to use a free software program called Rufus to create a bootable USB drive from bootable ISO images. You can find Rufus at rufus.ie and just download the latest version. In this case, it's 3.17. If you're using a Mac, you probably don't need to be watching this video, but in those cases, or Linux, you can just follow the instructions for using the DD command line to copy the bootable image to the flash drive. The speed of the flash drive you use will largely determine how long it takes to copy the bootable ISO file, and I've seen it take as long as an hour, so don't be impatient. We'll skip ahead to the end after we get it started. So the download is almost finished. 25 seconds left. Rufus is already downloaded. So we'll run Rufus. And we'll pick the flash drive. In this case, I've got one Kingston 16 gig already in there. And now we will pick the ISO that we're going to burn. And disk or ISO image, click here to select it. There's the ISO file, 2+ gigs. You can leave the rest of the settings default and then click start. The speed of the flash drive you use will largely determine how long it takes to copy the bootable ISO file, and obviously it'll take as long as an hour, so don't be impatient. Alright, all done. Took 15 minutes and 8 seconds. Now that the bootable ISO has been copied to flash, it's ready to use for install on whatever hardware you're going to use to control your machine or simulate a machine or whatever it is that you intend to do with it. In my case, I'm building a DIY CNC mill from a Precision Matthews 833 TV model made in Taiwan. It's a variation of a Rongfu 45 clone. I'm following a project by David Florian, or Dr. D-Flow, as he goes. His project video is linked as well as his website. Like David, I really like the aesthetics of the Probe Basic Linux GUI, so I'll be installing that after I install Linux CNC on the Intel NUC that I'm using as a controller. Probe Basic is a skin built on a Python GUI implementation for Linux CNC by KCJ Engineering. I don't know what the KCJ stands for. I think it's Kent or Ken, but I'm not positive. I could probably look it up. In any case, on to booting the Linux NUC off of the USB drive and installing Linux. Unfortunately, I lost the original audio, just wasn't paying attention to the settings. So we're booting up Linux on the NUC off the flash drive, and I'm going to go select advanced options instead of the normal start installer. I'm actually going to pick export install in text mode because that's what I'm used to. And the reason I'm not using the defaults is the Linux installation includes, the hardware rather, includes a wireless network connection that doesn't come with Debian because it's a non-free firmware. So I'm going to use a regular wired connection instead. So we're going to start with the text interface, which is what I use. I'm just hitting enter here. English, United States locale. And then I'm going to hit tab and down to continue because I don't need to add any additional locales. Don't need to add Braille. Don't need to reconfigure the keyboard, so I'm going to go and select detect and mount CD-ROM, which is the next step. That'll take a couple of seconds. I 100% support Debian projects' decision not to include non-free software on their base distribution. That is the right way to do it, in my opinion. So it's found the CD-ROM, and it's the normal buster, and it will now copy once I hit enter. It gives you the chance in expert mode to add additional installation elements like OpenSSH if you're doing this remotely via the network, but I'm not, so I don't need any of those. Hit tab and continue. It's going to install all of the various bits that are needed for the installation itself. The other main reason that I skip the automatic settings are, for some reason, it gets hung up trying to set up IPv6. I don't have IPv6 on my local network, and Debian's timeout while it tries to configure an IPv6 network is kind of irritating, and I just decided to skip it. So now we will detect network hardware, and this will show the wireless network that I was talking about that's non-free. There's nothing wrong with it. It's an Intel wireless, but the firmware is not something that they make open source available, or even, where you can just download it and use it. They have requirements. So no, I'm not going to load the missing firmware from removable media. Now, if you were setting this up wirelessly instead of via plugin, you probably would need to do this step, but I'm not going to go through it here. So we'll skip that. It's found the regular hardware. I'm going to configure the network manually instead of using auto configure, because the auto configure takes forever. Gets kind of hung up on DHCP6. It doesn't really work. So I'm putting in the IPv4 IP address, which is for my local network, 24-bit subnet, and the default gateway of .1. Instead of using the default gateway as the name server address, I'm going to use the Google 8.8.8.8 that you see so often. So that's pretty much it. All you need. The other thing is take note of the interface name, ENO1. That's not EN01, it's ENO1. And use that later. We'll set it to 3 seconds. And I'm going to change the host name to something that makes more sense to me. There's no need for a domain, so we'll skip that. We'll set up the users, enable shadow passwords. I'm going to create a new user called CNC, because you use this every time you start up the computer. A lot of people just use 1234 for the password on a machine like this. It's not going to be regularly connected to the network. We configure the clock to use NTP. I don't like using the Debian pool.ntp.org exists for a reason, so I am hard-headed, I guess, and we'll change it to that. Pick Eastern Time. Now we'll detect the hard disks. They're M2, so they should detect pretty quickly. And now we'll partition them. Partitioning can be done a lot of different ways for a lot of different reasons, a lot of different approaches to doing it. I actually like doing a more complex partition most of the time, but in this use case, specifically for a machine like this, whereas normally I would set up LVM because it makes it easier to modify and add storage and stuff later, it's really not going to be necessary. This machine is literally only going to be running Linux CNC for this one application. I'm not going to be running this as some kind of file server for videos and stuff later. This is just going to be a machine operating system, so I'm going to pick guided use entire disk. That's what I would actually recommend in most cases. Do make sure you pick the local internal hard drive though, not the flash drive. Now the other thing is whether you put partitions on separate partitions, home, temp, var. I see no need to do all that in this particular use case. There's plenty of good reasons to do that in other uses, but for this particular use case, machine control, just do it all in one. That's my opinion. So it's going to ask you multiple times, are you sure you want to do this? Because these are the changes that it's going to make. So this is going over and showing you the 3 partitions that it's going to create. And then when you say finish, it's going to ask you one more time. Now you can always go up to the choices at the top and back up if you're not done right, but we're going to say yes, write the changes to disk, and it won't take that long to actually format the M2 hard drive. ext4 is fairly fast. I'm leaving this in real time except for areas that I'll discuss when we jump ahead, because the most of the time this is actually real time is fast enough. There's a few things when the ultimate copy occurs that it makes sense to skip. So now we're gonna install the system. Normal versus live. Live is what we're running now from the boot, but that's not what we want. We want to install it normally so that it boots up as a normal installation. And I'm going to jump ahead here. So you'll see this move ahead very shortly. I think I condensed a 20-minute file copy to a few seconds. And now we're configuring the package manager, which is what allows you to install and uninstall software easily. And this will definitely be necessary when we go to install Probe Basic, because Probe Basic requirements aren't installed by default. So we'll have to install things like Python and Python Qt, etc. So we'll configure the package manager now. Download via HTTP, no proxy, so we'll just hit enter. And I'm enabling the source repositories. You don't have to. This is just probably a bad habit that I've gotten into over the years, but after having had to fix computers, 2 years after they were installed, 3 years, 5 years, sometimes 10 years, I find that having things like that turned on tend to be a lot more helpful than if they're turned off. You'll see in the next step when it asks to install the backports or not, that I will definitely select yes, backported software. I'd also recommend updating your Linux machines for Linux CNC pretty regularly, because if you let them get 2 or 3 years behind, it might be a problem. Not just from a security standpoint, but from a things change standpoint, and then might not necessarily have the stuff that you need to fix your issue, your compatibility problem. Now we're going to install the bootloader grub, and this takes a long time, so I skipped ahead right here. I don't know why it takes so long. It seems like every year grub takes longer to install. It's probably checking a lot of stuff in the background. Once grub is installed, the machine's ready to reboot. You don't need to do the EFI removable media path most of the time. I certainly don't, not with this hardware. And now we'll finish the installation. Clarify that the time is set to UTC in the hardware. And then we will clean up the mounted drives, and then once the computer starts to reboot, we can pull the flash drive out, and we're done installing Linux CNC. Alright, and now we're rebooting the Linux CNC box after the installation for the first time. And here comes the grub interface, and it's doing its thing with RAM disks, etc. And now we're jumping into the debug screen, and the GUI should be coming up in a second now. It's not a super fast computer. Okay, let's log in. First, log in on the new Linux CNC installation using the user and password that we created in the original installation. And there we go. So the first thing we're going to do is open up Firefox under Applications, and then down to Internet, then over to Firefox, and we're going to pull up the website for Probe Basic, which is https://kcjengr.github.io /probe_basic. I have found out since recording the first part of this video that KCJ stands for Kurt Jacobson, a mechanical and nuclear engineer who wrote this software. So thank you very much, Kurt Jacobson. We're reading the installation here. It starts with do what we've just done, download and install Linux CNC. They use Balena Etcher instead of Rufus.ie. And I have already done a sudo apt update off camera in a jump cut. So we're going to move ahead to the next part. Again, this is a voiceover. I lost the audio. We're going to move ahead to the sudo apt upgrade. And we're going to start that. And then I'm going to speed that up because it takes a while. And while it's finishing up, we will probably download the Probe Basic installer file. So let's jump ahead here much faster. It took about 6 minutes, I think. And whenever I do one of those things, I like to reboot the computer and then come back and do an auto remove to see if anything got taken out after that upgrade. So yeah, we're saving 1.5 meg. Not much. I mean, sometimes you get a couple hundred megs back, but we've cleared that up. So we've restarted the computer and cleared all that out. And now we'll pull Firefox back up. Again, Applications, Internet, Firefox, and pull up the bookmark for the Pro Basic install. I think I will skip reading the New York Times or the credit card ads there. So the next step is to start Linux CNC for the first time. So run Linux CNC and then just go down to Linux CNC. And it's going to ask you, run what. And it needs a config. It's got some defaults in there, but Axis is the one that comes with it, and most people run most of the time. The first time it runs, it creates the necessary folders for the Pro Basic install, which is why you want to run it one time. So we're going to close that. And now we'll do the package manager to install all of these requirements for Pro Basic. Lots of Python, lots of libraries. And we'll skip ahead for those as well. Zoom, 6 minutes into 2 seconds. And while that is still finishing up, we will go ahead and download the Pro Basic installer file. Which is it's just a shell script. Which runs a Python installation. So it's downloaded. That didn't take long. Pull up the file manager. And we'll drill down to the home directory and then the downloads. And follow the instructions to right click on the Pro Basic installer, run, and then select properties, and then check the box at the bottom of the properties that allows it to run as a program under permissions. And then we'll close. Now I could have probably double clicked it here, but I'm a command line guy, so I'm going to go back to the command line and change directory to that folder and then run it manually from the command line. So we'll change directory. And run the file. I think I'm going to probably skip ahead during this part too, once it gets through there. What are we going to install? Everything. Now, if you have not read these licenses, you need to. I've read all of them multiple times, but they actually do apply. So you need to pay attention and know what you're agreeing to. In the case of the GNU public licenses, they're fairly common, but the SNU open font license is probably a little different. So let's jump ahead here. Running about 1,000 speed. And finish. There's a couple of warnings, but I think it was on upgrade files that didn't exist. And I think we're done. So let's go ahead and close the Firefox and the terminal window. And then we'll run Linux CNC Pro Basic. So down to CNC and Linux CNC, and When it pops up to ask us to find a config, there the Probe Basic is at the top now. So we'll open it up, and there's several config. You got an automatic tool changer simulate, and then a Probe Basic, and then Probe Basic for lathe. We're just going to open that one and click Probe Basic. Now click Open. OK. I am going to create a desktop shortcut here just to make it easier to test in the future. And it warns you that it's going to do that. And now it is opening Linux CNC, and voila, here comes the Probe Basic interface instead of Axis. It looks so much nicer, aesthetically much more pleasing. It frankly looks a lot like what they use on the Linux CNC implementation for Tormach. I don't know if they copied Probe Basic or if Probe Basic copied them. It's hard to say. But in any case, there it is. We'll shut the system down now. Thank you for watching. I hope this has been helpful to some folks.